wind was a sculptor, and the land its unwilling stone. For years it had worked on Silas Blackwood, carving lines of solitude around his eyes, hollowing out the spaces where laughter might have once lived. His homestead was an island in a sea of dust and unforgiving sun, a penance he paid daily for a debt etched onto his soul. The cabin was spare, built by his own hands, each plank a testament to a desire to be forgotten by the world he had once hunted. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, a man who had learned that wasted energy was a luxury, like hope. Today, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a churning slate gray that promised violence. A storm was coming, not the gentle kind that renewed the earth, but the kind that tore it apart. Silas secured the latch on his small barn, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the clouds roiled like a pot of black ink set to boil. He felt a kinship with the coming tempest, a resonance with its contained fury. It was a language he understood, better than the easy chatter of townfolk or the hollow pronouncements of preachers. He was a man of few words, because words were promises, and he had broken the most important one long ago. Now he spoke only to his horse, a stoic beast as silent as himself, and to the ghosts that whispered in the scream of the wind. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and damp earth, a final tense inhalation before the sky's inevitable exhale. He checked the fastenings on his windows, his knuckles white against the weathered wood. Everything on his land was battened down, secured, prepared for the onslaught. He had built his life around the principle of weathering storms, both literal and metaphorical. He believed himself to be an unbreachable fortress of regret, a place where no new sorrow could ever find purchase. He was wrong. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to strike the packed earth like thrown pebbles. Silence stood on his porch, a solitary figure against the vast, darkening landscape, and watched the world dissolve into a gray curtain of water. He felt nothing, or so he told himself. He was merely an observer, a stone in the river, unmoved by the current. But deep within him, in a place he kept locked and barred, something stirred, a premonition, a flicker of disquiet that had nothing to do with the wind or the rain. It was the feeling of a magnet turning toward a pole it had long since forgotten, the sense that the world, for all his efforts to hold it at bay, was about to break upon his shore. He turned to go inside, to wait out the storm in the familiar gloom of his cabin, when a flicker of impossible white against the deepening brown of the mud-choked trail caught his eye. It was something that did not belong, a shard of porcelain in a field of rock, an anomaly that sent a jolt through his constructed numbness. A church in prosperity was not a house of God. It was the cage, built of piety and judgment. The air inside was thick with the scent of wilting flowers and the silent, suffocating weight of expectation. Elara Vance stood at the altar, a ghost in a white dress, the fabric a cruel mockery of a purity she felt had been stripped from her long ago. Before her stood Jedediah Croft, a man whose wealth was as vast as his cruelty, his eyes possessing the flat, proprietary gleam of a man appraising livestock. He was not a husband-to-be. He was a final payment on a debt her father had left behind, a pound of flesh to be rendered in the form of her life. The town watched, their faces a gallery of grim satisfaction and pitying scorn. They saw a transaction, the closing of a ledger. They did not see the young woman who dreamt of a life painted in colors other than gray, who remembered her mother's gentle hands and her father's laughter before the blight took the crops and despair took his spirit. Now, there was only the cold finality of this moment. The preacher, a man whose morality was as pliable as Croft's gold, droned on, his words weaving the bars of her prison. And if any person here can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed was a living thing. It pressed in on Elara, stealing the air from her lungs. Forever. The word was a death sentence. Forever chained to this man, his casual brutality, his suffocating ownership. She looked past his shoulder, through the arched window, and saw the sky churning. A storm was coming, a wild, untamed thing, a mirror to the chaos screaming inside her own heart. In that moment, something fractured. The years of quiet endurance, of swallowing sorrow like a bitter pill, it all shattered. The town's gaze, Croft's smug smile, the preacher's hollow words, they became distant, dreamlike. All that was real was the pounding in her ears, a drumbeat of rebellion. She thought of her mother, who had once told her that the bravest thing a person could do was to choose their own path, even if it was the harder one. Forever. The word echoed again, but this time, it was not a sentence, it was a challenge. Her gaze dropped to the worn wooden floorboards. Then, lifted to meet the preacher's questioning eyes. Croft shifted beside her, his impatience a palpable force. He reached for her hand, his touch like ice. A breath, a single shuddering intake of air that was entirely her own. It was the first breath of freedom, and it burned like fire. Jedediah Croft's fingers tightened on her wrist, a manacle of flesh and bone. The preacher's mouth opened to deliver the final, binding words. But another voice, small and trembling yet clear as a bell in the crushing silence, cut through the air. "I do." It was her own voice, and it sounded like a stranger's. It was not an affirmation. It was an objection. An objection to this man, to this town, to this life that was being forced upon her. She said it again, louder this time, her eyes locked on the stunned face of the preacher. "I have just cause." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Jedediah's face, a moment ago smug and triumphant, twisted into a mask of pure reptilian fury. "What is the meaning of this, girl?" he hissed, his grip tightening enough to make her wince. But the pain was distant. The fear was already burning away, replaced by a desperate, exhilarating clarity. She pulled her hand from his grasp with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She turned, not to the preacher, not to her would-be husband, but to the faces of the town. "The cause," she said, her voice gaining strength, "is that my soul is not for sale." She did not wait for their condemnation. She did not wait for Croft's rage to erupt into violence. She turned and ran. The white dress, meant to be the symbol of her bondage, became the banner of her escape. She fled down the aisle, past the rows of stunned faces, their mouths agape. Someone tried to grab her arm, but she dodged, fueled by an adrenaline born of pure desperation. She burst through the heavy church doors and into the electric waiting air. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. The wind tore at her veil, ripping it from her hair and sending it cartwheeling into the gray sky like a frantic ghost. Rain began to fall, cold and sharp, plastering the fine silk of her dress to her skin. Behind her, she heard a roar of outrage. Croft's voice, a promise of retribution. She didn't look back. She ran, her slippered feet slipping on the wet stones of the street, her only destination away, away from the cage, away from the debt, away from the man who would own her. She ran toward the wilderness that bordered the town, a place of shadows and secrets, a place where a person could disappear. She ran toward the heart of the storm. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and sound. The manicured streets of prosperity gave way to a muddy, rutted track that bled into the open country. Ilara's lungs burned, each breath a ragged tear in the fabric of the storm. Her wedding slippers, made for a gentle walk down an aisle, were no match for the sucking mud and sharp stones. One was lost to a greedy puddle, and then the other, leaving her to run barefoot, the cold earth shocking. The pristine white dress was a casualty of her flight, its hem ripped and tattered, stained with the brown blood of the trail. It clung to her like a second, colder skin, a heavy shroud of what might have been. But she did not care. The destruction of the dress was the destruction of her prison. Each tear, each stain, was a mark of her liberation. She ran with no destination in mind, only the desperate imperative to put distance between herself and the life she had just refused. The sounds of the town Croft's bellows, the confused shouts, were swallowed by the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain. The storm was her ally, a chaotic cloak that shielded her from pursuit. It washed away her scent, her tracks, her very presence in the world. It was a baptism, a violent cleansing of the girl who had walked into that church. Branches, skeletal and black in the gloom, clawed at her, tearing at her dress and her skin, leaving thin red lines on her arms. She stumbled, fell to her knees in the mud, the impact jarring her bones. For a moment, she stayed there, gasping, the rain plastering her hair to her face. Despair, a cold and familiar companion, tried to whisper in her ear, "You can't escape, he will find you." But then she looked up, and through the sheets of rain she saw the vast, unbroken wilderness ahead. It was terrifying, but it was empty of Jedediah Croft. It was empty of the judging eyes of the town. It was a blank page. With a cry that was half sob, half defiance, she pushed herself back to her feet. Her strength was failing, her body screaming in protest. Each step was a monumental effort. The cold was beginning to seep into her bones, a deep, numbing chill that slowed her movements. The world began to tilt, the trees swaying not just with the wind, but with her own failing equilibrium. She ran, until her legs were lead, until her vision swam with black spots. She saw a fence line, a demarcation between the wild and something else, something tamed. It seemed an impossible distance away. She fixed her eyes on a fence post, making it her final goal. One more step, and another. Her body finally gave its last command. Her legs buckled, her consciousness frayed, and she fell forward, landing in a heap of mud and ruined silk, a broken dove at the edge of a stranger's world. The last thing she knew was the feeling of rain on her face, and then only darkness. Silas moved toward the impossible flicker of white with the cautious, deliberate steps of a man approaching a wounded animal. The storm raged around him, a symphony of fury that seemed to focus its intensity on this one small point of vulnerability. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself from an anomaly into a nightmare. A woman, face down in the mud, her form clad in what looked like the tattered remnants of a wedding dress. Her hair, a dark spill of silk, was fanned out in the muck, and one pale, bare foot was visible beneath the ruined hem. For a long moment, Silas simply stood there, the rain sluicing off the brim of his hat, his mind struggling to process the scene. This was his land, his isolation. It was a sanctuary, built to keep the complications of the world out. And here was the world in its most complicated form, collapsed on his doorstep. His first instinct, the one honed by years of solitude and self-preservation, was to turn back, to retreat to his cabin, bar the door, and let the storm handle its own. This was not his concern. He had renounced the role of protector, of rescuer. The last time he had tried, the cost had been 2 lives and the entirety of his own soul. He could still hear the woman's scream, see the child's wide, trusting eyes. No, he would not walk that path again. He took a half-step back, his boots sinking into the wet earth, but he couldn't take the second. He looked at the fragile shape in the mud, the slender curve of her back, the utter stillness of her. She was a thing of profound distress, a life on the very precipice. To walk away now would not be self-preservation, it would be a different kind of damnation. It would be an act of cowardice so profound, it would make his past failures seem like minor transgressions. A low growl of frustration escaped his throat, lost in the wind. Cursing the sky, the woman, and his own traitorous conscience, he strode forward. He knelt in the mud beside her, his knees soaking through in an instant. Gently, he reached out and placed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. He held his breath, waiting, and then he felt it. A pulse, faint, thready, but there, a stubborn spark of life refusing to be extinguished. A wave of something he couldn't name, relief, dread, responsibility, washed over him. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire past, he carefully slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, one under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless, a fragile collection of bone and cold skin. He lifted her from the mud. As he stood, cradling her against his chest, her head lolled against his shoulder, he started the slow, heavy walk back to the cabin, his fortress, its walls now breached. The warmth of the cabin was a stark contrast to the violence of the storm outside. Silas moved with a quiet efficiency, his actions gentle and deliberate. He laid the unconscious woman on the simple cot in the corner of the main room, her ruined dress pooling around her like dirty snow. For a moment he was paralyzed by a sense of trespass. This was an intrusion of femininity, of fragility into a space he had deliberately kept hard and masculine. Her presence was a disruption to the very air he breathed. He shook himself free of the thought. She was cold, verging on hypothermia. Practicalities first. He stoked the fire in the hearth until it blazed, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls and across her pale face. The dress was soaked and caked with mud. It had to come off. He approached the task with the detached professionalism of a battlefield medic, a skill he'd learned in a life he was trying to forget. He found the long row of tiny pearl buttons that ran down her back, his large calloused fingers clumsy against their delicacy. He worked them free one by one, his knuckles occasionally brushing the cold skin of her back. He kept his eyes averted, focusing only on the task, granting her a dignity in her unconsciousness that he felt was paramount. He managed to peel the sodden garment away, revealing a simple chemise beneath, and quickly, averting his gaze, covered her to her chin with a thick wool blanket. He took the ruined dress and without a second thought, cast it into the fire. It smoked and hissed for a moment, before the flames consumed it, a final, fiery punctuation to the day's escape. He then fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He sat on a stool beside the cot and began to gently wash the mud from her face, her neck, and her hands. Her features beneath the grime were fine and delicate, but etched with exhaustion and fear, even in sleep. He worked in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind against the cabin walls. When he was done, he simply sat and watched her, a silent vigil. He was guarding a stranger, a woman without a name or a past who had washed up on the shores of his solitude. He felt the old, familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. It was a heavy cloak, one he had sworn never to wear again. But as he looked at her, at the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of the blanket, he knew he had no choice. He had brought her in from the storm. Now he had to make sure. The storm didn't follow her inside. Alara surfaced from a deep, dreamless darkness into a world of muffled sound and flickering light. Her first sensation was warmth, a profound, bone-deep heat that felt alien and luxurious. Her eyelids were heavy, glued shut with sleep. She remembered running, the cold, the mud. She expected to wake to that same cold, or perhaps not to wake at all. But this warmth was real. It was a thick wool blanket tucked securely around her shoulders. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. She heard the crackle of a fire and the relentless, rhythmic drumming of rain against a roof. She was inside. She was safe. She forced her eyes open. The light was dim, coming from a stone hearth where a healthy fire blazed. The room was simple, spare. Hewn log walls, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a few shelves holding tins and supplies. It was a man's space, ascetic and orderly. And in the corner, sitting in a chair, shrouded in shadow, was a man. He was perfectly still, watching her. Terror, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She tried to scramble back, to cry out, but her limbs felt like lead in her throat. A small, choked gasp was all she could manage. The man did not move. He simply continued to watch her, his expression unreadable in the shifting firelight. He was large, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as though it were carved from the same weathered wood as the cabin walls. She saw the glint of his eyes, watchful and intense. He was not Croft. The realization did little to soothe her panic. Who was he? Where was she? She pushed herself up onto her elbows, the blanket pooling around her waist. She looked down and saw she was wearing her chemise. Her dress, her beautiful ruined dress, was gone. The violation of it, the intimacy of a stranger having undressed her, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The man must have seen the panic in her eyes. He slowly, deliberately stood up. He did not approach her. Instead, he walked to the table, picked up a tin cup and filled it with water from a bucket. He placed the cup on the floor a few feet from her cot, then retreated back to his chair in the shadows. It was the gesture one would make to a frightened animal. It was an offering, not a demand. He was giving her space, a choice. For a long while she just stared at the cup, her thirst a raging fire in her throat. The man remained silent, a statue in the corner. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the storm. Finally her thirst won out over her fear. Finally, her eyes never leaving him, she reached out a trembling hand and took the cup. The water was cool and clean. The most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank it all, then placed the empty cup back on the floor. She looked at the man in the corner. His expression hadn't changed. He simply nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and turned his gaze back to the fire. He was not a threat. Not yet. He was a mystery, a silent guardian in a house of shadows. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The silence that descended was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. Alara lay awake on the cot, listening. She heard the drip of water from the eaves, the soft sigh of the fire as it dwindled to embers, and the sound of the man's steady breathing from a corner of the room, where he slept on a bedroll on the floor. He had given her the only bed. The gesture was not lost on her. As the first pale fingers of light crept through the window, she saw him stir. He rose with the fluid, silent grace of a predator, his movements economical and sure. He did not look at her, pretending she was still asleep, granting her a small privacy. He rekindled the fire, put a pot of coffee on to boil, and then slipped out the door, closing it softly behind him. Alara sat up, wrapping the wool blanket around her shoulders. She felt weak, bruised, but alive. The fear from the night before had receded, replaced by a deep, weary uncertainty. She was a fugitive. She had nothing but the simple chemise she wore and a small locket around her neck. She was utterly dependent on the mercy of the silent, imposing man whose home she had invaded. She heard him outside, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. The sound was steady, reassuring. It was the sound of order, of life continuing. She crept to the window and peered out. The man, Silas, she had heard him murmur the name in a troubled sleep, was at the woodpile, his back to her. He worked without a shirt, in the cool morning air, his back a landscape of muscle and old faded scars. She watched the powerful swing of the axe, the clean split of the wood. He was capable, strong. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He was a man accustomed to hard work and solitude. He paused, stacking a piece of wood, and for a reason she couldn't explain, he looked over his shoulder, directly at the window where she stood. Their eyes met for a brief, startling second across the yard. His were a startling gray, the color of the sky after the storm, and they held an unnerving intensity. She quickly ducked back from the window, her heart pounding. It felt as if he had looked right through the walls, right into her. A short while later he came back inside, his arms laden with freshly split firewood. He still did not speak, did not acknowledge her beyond a brief, fleeting glance. He set the wood by the hearth, poured 2 cups of coffee, and placed one on the small table. He then took his own and went to sit on the porch steps, his back to the open door, leaving her alone in the warmth of the cabin. It was another offering: food, warmth, and distance. He was building a strange kind of trust, one wordless gesture at a time. A second day bled into a third, and the silence in the cabin became a language all its own. It was a weighted silence, not an empty one. It was built of observation, caution, and a fragile, unspoken truce. Silas moved through his chores with the relentless rhythm of a man who had long ago made peace with monotony. He mended a fence at the far end of his property, his form a distant, solitary figure against the vast canvas of the plains. Ilara watched him from the cabin window, which had become her hesitant perch. She saw the way he moved, the patience in his hands as he twisted wire, the strength in his back as he drove a new post into the unforgiving earth. She was watching a man who belonged to this land, or perhaps was owned by it. She saw no cruelty in him, only a profound and impenetrable sadness. It clung to him like the dust of the trail, a permanent part of his being. He, in turn, was acutely aware of her presence. He could feel her gaze on his back as he worked, a light pressure that was both a comfort and a torment. It had been years since anyone had watched him, had taken notice of his existence. Her silent observation was a reminder that he was no longer truly alone, a fact that his soul both craved and rejected. He was a fortress whose single inhabitant was growing, accustomed to the ghost that now haunted its halls. He never pressed her for a name, for her story. He understood that her silence was a shield, a necessary armor after whatever trauma had sent her fleeing into the storm. He would let her lower it in her own time, or not at all. His duty as he saw it was simple: to provide sanctuary. He would leave food for her on the table, a bowl of stew, a thick slice of bread, and then retreat, allowing her to eat without the pressure of his presence. He treated her, not as a woman or a guest, but as a wild, startled thing he was patiently trying to tame, not with a leash, but with a consistent, gentle respect for her boundaries. He slept on the floor, leaving her the cot. He kept his back to her when she moved about the cabin. These small, unspoken curses were the bricks with which he was building a foundation for trust. He was learning her rhythms, the soft pad of her bare feet on the wooden floor, the way she would hold a cup of coffee in both hands, as if drawing life from its warmth. And she was learning his, the weariness in his shoulders when he came in at dusk, the way his jaw would clench when he stared too long into the fire, as if watching a painful memory replay itself in the flames. They were 2 solitary planets, slowly, cautiously, falling into a shared orbit, their gravity the unspoken understanding of shared wounds. The offering appeared on the 3rd evening. Silas came in from the dusk, his face grim with the day's labor. He set a bowl of venison stew on the table for her, the familiar ritual of their silent coexistence. But this time there was something else. He reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small, crudely carved object. He placed it on the table next to her bowl, before retreating to his customary spot on the porch. Ilara stared at it. It was a bird, a small wren, carved from a piece of light-colored wood. The details were surprisingly fine. The delicate shape of the wings, the slight upward tilt of its head. It was an object of simple, unadorned beauty. She picked it up, the wood smooth and warm against her palm. It was an act of creation, a small piece of artistry in this world of harsh practicalities. It was a gift. It was a question. It was 100 things he could not say with words. She ate her stew, the small bird resting on the table before her, its silent presence a comfort. The man on the porch was not just a brute force of labor, he was something more. Later that night, as the fire burned low, she saw him take a piece of cloth from his saddlebag. It was white, or had been once. It was ripped and stained. She recognized it instantly. The sleeve of her wedding dress. She had assumed he'd burned the entire thing. He had saved this piece. She watched, her breath caught in her throat as he threaded a needle with a sureness that belied his large, rough hands. He spread the fabric on his knee and began to stitch the airs. His brow furrowed in concentration. The work was slow, meticulous. He was not just mending cloth, He was performing an act of restoration. He was trying to repair what had been broken. It was an apology for having to remove the dress from her, a gesture of profound and unexpected tenderness. She watched him for over an hour, the slow, rhythmic pull of the needle a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. This silent, haunted man was showing her a kindness she hadn't known since her mother died. He was taking care of her, not because he had to, not for any reward, but simply because she was there, and she was in need. Her fear, which had been a constant cold knot in her stomach, finally began to loosen its grip. It did not disappear, but it made room for something new, something fragile and tentative, gratitude. The next morning, the air in the cabin felt different. The silence was still there, but its texture had changed. It was less a wall and more a space, waiting to be filled. Silas was cleaning his rifle at the table, his movements precise and familiar. Ilara had been watching him, gathering her courage like a handful of scattered seeds. The mended sleeve of her dress was folded neatly on the foot of her cot where he had left it. It was a flag of truce. She stood up, the wool blanket wrapped around her, and walked to the hearth where the coffee pot was simmering. She poured a cup, her hands surprisingly steady, and walked to the table. She set the cup down near his elbow. He set his work, his hands frozen over the rifle parts. He looked at the cup, then slowly, he lifted his gaze to her face. His gray eyes were wary, questioning. She met his gaze directly for the first time without flinching. Her throat was dry, and the words felt clumsy, foreign, after days of disuse. "Thank you," the two words were a whisper, barely audible above the hiss of the fire clap. But in the quiet of the cabin, they landed with the force of a thunderclap. They were the first words she had spoken since her flight from the church. They were the first words to pass between them. Silas stared at her, his expression unreadable, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe something more. The granite mask of his face seemed to soften, just for a second. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He did not speak, but he didn't need to. The silence that followed was no longer a void. It was an answer. It was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of a conversation that had started days ago, with a blanket, a bowl of stew, and a carved wooden bird. Ilara retreated to her side of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had broken her own silence. She had crossed a bridge of her own making. As Silas picked up the cup of coffee and took a slow sip, a fragile peace settled over the small cabin, a peace born not of an absence of words, but of the immense weight of two that had finally been spoken. She had reclaimed her voice, and with it, a piece of herself she thought she had lost forever in the storm. The dam of silence, once reached, began to crumble. The change was not a flood, but a slow, steady trickle. The words came in small increments, fragile offerings exchanged in the quiet hours of dusk and dawn. He learned her name was Ilara. The word felt strange on his tongue, a sound too delicate for the harsh landscape of his life. She learned he was Silas. His name sounded like the wind sighing through the pines, solid and solitary. They did not speak of the past. Not yet. They spoke of the present, of practical things. The coffee is hot. The firewood is running low. It looks like more rain. Each sentence was a carefully placed stone, building a bridge across the chasm of their mutual reticence. One afternoon, Ilara was sitting on the porch steps, the carved bird in her hands, when Silas came to sit near her, not close enough to be an intrusion, but not as far as he usually kept. He was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a familiar, comforting sound. "You ran hard," he said, his eyes on his work. It was not a question, but an observation. Ilara traced the lines of the wooden bird's wing with her fingertip. "He had to," she replied, her voice soft. "He would not have let me go." Silas's hands paused for a fraction of a second. "He? Jetta Croft," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "My father owed him a great deal of money when he died. Croft decided to collect the debt in person." She did not need to elaborate. The grim set of Silas's jaw told her he understood perfectly. He had seen the way of the world, where women and land were often considered interchangeable commodities. He finished sharpening his knife, the silence stretching between them again. But this time it was a shared silence, a space of mutual understanding. He wiped the blade clean and looked at her, his gray eyes holding a deep, cold anger that was not directed at her. "A man like that," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, "believes he owns whatever he can buy or take." He stood up, the conversation over, but the bridge between them was stronger now, fortified by a shared condemnation of the man who had cost her so much. Ilara watched him walk toward the barn, a tall, lonely figure against the setting sun. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't just feel safe in his presence, she felt defended. One evening, As a chill wind rattled the window panes, they sat by the fire, a comfortable quiet having settled between them. The initial tension had evaporated, replaced by a familiarity born of shared space and slow-building trust. Ilara was tracing the faded pattern on her silver locket, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Silas, who missed very little, noticed the gesture. "A keepsake?" he asked, his voice softer than usual in the firelight. She nodded, her fingers closing around the cool metal. "My parents," she whispered. "It's all I have left of them." With trembling fingers, she opened the small oval clasp. Inside were two tiny faded portraits, a man with kind eyes and a woman with a gentle smile that mirrored Ilara's own. She held it out for him to see. Silas leaned forward, his gaze falling on the miniature faces. He stared at the locket for a long time, his own face a mask of impenetrable sorrow. The sight of the small, cherished family seemed to trigger something deep within him, a memory that pulled him under like a vicious tide. "It's important to have something to hold on to," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide. He straightened up, turning his face back toward the flames, but Ilara saw the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes. "Some things, some people, you can't hold on to," he continued, speaking more to the fire than to her, "no matter how hard you try." The confession, though vague, was heavy with the weight of a specific, terrible loss. Bella felt a wave of empathy for this broken man. She had been so consumed by her own escape, her own grief, that she hadn't truly considered the depth of his. She now understood that his solitude was not a preference, it was a wound. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for his loss, whatever it may have been." He shook his head, a small dismissive gesture. "The past is a ghost," he rumbled, his voice regaining its implicity. "The past is ghost," he rumbled. "Best not to invite it in for supper. It has a habit of overstaying its welcome." He stood abruptly and went to check the latch on the door, a familiar ritual that Ilara now recognized as his way of ending a conversation that veered too close to the heart of his pain. But the door had been opened, just a crack. She had seen the ghost that haunted him, and in its sorrowful eyes, she had seen a reflection of her own. As the days turned into weeks, a subtle transformation began to occur, not just between them, but within the homestead itself. Ilara, no longer content to be a passive observer, started to pour her quiet energy into the space around her. She was healing, and with her healing came a need to nurture, to create. She found a neglected patch of earth behind the cabin, a place where the sun lingered longest. It was choked with weeds and littered with stones, much like her own life had been. With a rusted spade she found in the barn, she began to work. At first, Silas watched her with a wary eye, unsure of her purpose. He saw her clearing the weeds, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands soft and uncolored, quickly becoming raw from the labor. He said nothing, but the next morning, a pair of his old leather work gloves appeared on the porch railing beside her door. She put them on. They were too big, but they were a shield, another of his silent, practical kindnesses. Day after day she toiled in her small plot of land. She cleared the stones, turned the soil, and coaxed it back to life. Silas, on a trip to the distant settlement for supplies, returned with a small cloth sack. He left it on the table without a word. Inside, Ilara found seeds, beans, squash, corn, hope in tiny, hardened shells. The act of planting was a prayer. With each seed she pushed into the dark, welcoming earth, she felt as though she were planting a piece of herself, a promise for a future. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could cultivate life in the midst of a landscape that often seemed dedicated to death. It was a tangible symbol of her resilience. She was no longer the frightened girl who had collapsed in the mud. She was a woman putting down roots. Silas would watch her from a distance as he went about his own chores. He saw the way she tended the first fragile green shoots that pushed their way toward the sun. He saw the quiet joy on her face, a look of profound peace. Her small garden was an act of defiance against the harshness of the world. It was a splash of vibrant living color on the monochrome canvas of his existence, and it was beautiful. He was beginning to realize that she hadn't just brought herself to his homestead. She had brought life itself. In the dusty, sun-baked town of Prosperity, Jedediah Croft's humiliation had curdled into a black and venomous rage. To be denied, publicly, by a slip of a girl he considered little more than property, was an insult he could not abide. His authority, built on a foundation of wealth and fear, had been challenged, and the crack had to be sealed with a brutal and public display of power. He would have her back, not because he wanted her, not anymore, but because he could not allow her to be free. Her freedom was his shame. He sat in the smoky back room of the saloon, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and desperation. Across the table from him sat a man whose reputation was as sharp and deadly as the spurs on his boots. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he was not a man you hired for simple jobs. You hired Thorne when you wanted something found and brought back, with no questions asked about the state in which it was returned. Thorne listened to Croft's blustering account with a look of detached, predatory amusement. He was a lean, wiry man with eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached them. "So this girl," Thorne said, his voice a dry rasp. "She ran north, into the Badlands. Not a place for a delicate flower." "She is not delicate. She is a thief," Croft spat, slamming his fist on the table. "She ran from a legal contract. She owes me." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a wanted poster, hastily printed. It depicted a crude, almost monstrous drawing of Ilara, labeling her a runaway debtor and thief, and offering a substantial reward for her capture in return. Thorne picked it up, his eyes scanning the text. "A generous sum," he commented, a flicker of interest in his cold eyes. "And you say she was last seen heading towards the Blackwood territory?" Croft nodded. "Hermit's land. No one goes out there." A strange, slow smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. It was a smile of recognition, of grim satisfaction. Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. The name was a ghost from his own past. A partner who had gone soft, who had walked away from a fortune to go live in the dirt like a penitent monk. Thorne had always wondered what had become of him. The idea that this runaway girl might have stumbled into Silas's self-imposed exile was a twist of fate too delicious to ignore. This job was no longer just about the money. It was about settling an old score. "I'll find your girl, Mr. Croft," Thorne said, folding the poster and tucking it into his coat. "And if my old friend Silas is involved, well, that will just be a bonus." Marcus Thorne rode with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world was his hunting ground. The trail north from prosperity was cold, but Thorne was patient. He was a student of human desperation, and he knew the girl, Ilara, would have left signs a town-bred posse would miss. A broken twig, a scuff of mud on a rock, the faintest impression of a bare foot in a patch of soft earth. He was not just a tracker, he was a reader of stories left upon the land. And her story was one of panic and flight. He found the place where she had collapsed, the indentation in the ground still visible, a few torn threads of white silk snagged on a thorny bush nearby, and from there, leading straight toward the grim, solitary cabin in the distance, were the deep, purposeful tracks of a man's boots. One set of tracks leading out, another set, leading back, deeper, heavier. The tracks of a man carrying something, or someone. Thorne dismounted, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. Silas. It had to be. Only Silas Blackwood would be stubborn enough to carve out a life in this god-forsaken landscape, and only Silas would be foolish enough to take in a stray. A deep-seated resentment, years old, bubbled up in Thorne's chest. He and Silas had been the best. A ruthless, efficient team that had brought in bounties others wouldn't dare touch. They were feared, from the border to the territories. But then Silas had changed. After that job in Willow Creek, the one with the farmer, his wife, and the boy, something in Silas had broken. He'd lost his nerve, started talking about debts and souls, nonsense that had no place in their line of work. He had walked away, leaving Thorne with half of a partnership and a full measure of contempt. Thorne had always seen Silas's retreat as a weakness, a betrayal. To find him now, playing nursemaid to some runaway girl, confirmed all of Thorne's disdain. This wasn't just a job anymore, this was a reckoning. He would enjoy this. He would enjoy peeling back the layers of Silas's quiet, hermit-like existence and exposing the soft, rotten core he knew was hiding underneath. He would take the girl, collect the bounty, and leave Silas alone again in his dusty kingdom of regret, a fresh failure to add to his collection. He swung back into his saddle, his eyes fixed on the plume of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. The hunt was almost over. The reunion was about to begin. The homestead had run low on salt and coffee, necessities that even a man in self-imposed exile could not do without. Silas knew the trip to the settlement was a risk, but it was a necessary one. He left Ilara with a stern warning to stay inside and out of sight, a warning she accepted with a solemn, understanding nod. The bond between them had deepened into a quiet partnership, an unspoken alliance against the world outside their small sanctuary. The ride to the settlement was tense, every shadow on the trail seeming to hold a threat. When he arrived, the atmosphere was thick with a hostility he could feel on his skin. Faces turned away as he passed. Men who would normally offer a gruff nod now stared at the ground. Something was wrong. He tied his horse outside the general store and pushed through the door. The storekeeper, a man Silas had traded with for years, busied himself with stacking tins, refusing to meet his eye. It was on the wall, nailed next to notices for livestock auctions and land sales that he saw it. The wanted poster. His blood ran cold. The drawing was a grotesque mockery of Alara's features, but it was unmistakably her. Runaway debtor. Thief. The words were lies. Poison meant to turn the world against her. And beneath it all, the name. Jedediah Croft. The final line offered a reward that would make a desperate man do desperate things. A low growl rumbled in Silas's chest. This was Croft's doing, a public branding to shame and capture her. He reached out and tore the poster from the wall, crumpling it into a tight ball in his fist. "She's no thief," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The storekeeper flinched but didn't turn around. "Ain't my business, Silas. Just be careful." Silas bought his supplies in stony silence and turned to leave. As he stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, he saw a group of men lounging near the saloon, their voices loud and crude. They were talking about the poster, about the girl. Their words were vile, speculative, painting pictures of what they'd do for a share of that reward. They were vultures, circling a kill they hadn't yet made. He knew he should walk away, ride back to the homestead and prepare for the inevitable. But the thought of their foul words tainting Alara's name, the thought of them, speaking of her as a piece of meat, ignited a cold, pure rage in him. The protector, he thought he had buried long ago, rose from its grave. Silas's stride did not falter as he walked directly toward the group of men. They fell silent as he approached, their bravado shrinking under the intensity of his gaze. He was not a large man, by nature of his bulk, but he possessed an aura of contained violence that was far more intimidating than mere size. Years of living on the edge had honed it to a razor's sharpness. He stopped before them, the crumpled poster still clenched in his fist. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence that had fallen was more powerful than any shout. "I heard you talking," he said, his voice the sound of gravel grinding against stone. "About the girl. On the poster." One of the men, made bold by whiskey, tried to sneer. "What's it to you, Blackwood? Thinking of claiming that reward yourself?" Silas's eyes, cold as a winter river, locked onto the man. The man's sneer faltered. Silas slowly uncurled his fist, letting the crumpled poster fall to the dust between them. "The lies on that paper and the filth coming out of your mouths will stop now." His voice was flat, a simple statement of fact, not a threat. But every man there heard the promise of violence coiled beneath the words. "You don't know her," Silas continued, his gaze sweeping over each of their faces, branding them with his contempt. "You don't know anything, but you will know this." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the hot, still air. "She is under my protection." He let the declaration hang there for a long moment, a shield and a warning. It was a line drawn in the dust, a gauntlet thrown down. He was no longer just a hermit, hiding from his past. He was a guardian. He had claimed her, not as property in the way Croft had, but as a life he was sworn to defend. He turned his back on them, a gesture of supreme confidence and dismissal, and walked to his horse. He mounted, not looking back, and rode out of the settlement, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in his wake. The men watched him go, the whiskey courage having evaporated from their veins. They knew they had not just been talking to a reclusive rancher. They had been talking to the man Silas Blackwood used to be, a man whose name had once been a whispered legend in the territories. And they knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the girl on the poster was as good as a ghost to them. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of grim purpose. The solitude of the trail offered no comfort, only a space for Silas's thoughts to race. The cold fury he had felt in town had subsided, replaced by the chillingly familiar feeling of a closing trap. He had announced his position, had publicly declared war on Jedediah Croft and any man foolish enough to side with him. The sanctuary was no longer a secret, it was now a target. The old instincts, the ones he had tried to starve and bury under years of penance and hard labor, stirred within him. The hyper-awareness, the way his eyes scanned the ridgeline for movement, the way his hand rested naturally on the butt of his pistol. It was like shrugging on an old, blood-stained coat. He hated the feeling. It was the skin of a man he no longer wanted to be, the bounty hunter, the predator. But he also knew he needed it. The farmer in him, the man who tended the earth and sought peace, could not protect Alara from the storm that was coming. Only the hunter could do that. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had built this life to escape the violence of his past, to create a place where blood would not be shed. He had brought Alara into that peace, and in doing so, he had inadvertently painted a target on it. His attempt at redemption had led the wolves right to his door. By the time he saw the thin plume of smoke from his cabin chimney, His mind was made. He would not run. He had run once before, run from his failure in Willow Creek, and it had solved nothing. It had only hollowed him out, left him a shell of a man. This time, he would stand his ground. This land, which had been his prison, had become something else. It had become a home, made so by the quiet presence of a woman in her small, stubborn garden. He would not let Croft or any other man tear it down. He rode into the yard, his face set like stone. Elara was on the porch, a worried look in her eyes. She had seen the hard set of his shoulders, the thunder in his expression, from 100 yards away. She knew he brought bad news. He swung down from his horse, his movements stiff with resolve. He had left that morning, a reclusive rancher. He returned, a reluctant warrior. He did not try to soften the blow. He walked onto the porch, looked Elara in the eye, and told her everything. He told her about the wanted poster, the lies Croft was spreading, the reward that had put a price on her head. He told her about the encounter in town, about his public declaration. As he spoke, he watched her face, expecting to see the return of the terror he'd seen that first night. He expected her to crumble, to be consumed by the fear of being hunted, but she did not. She listened with a grave stillness, her gaze unwavering. The fragility he had first seen in her was gone, burned away, and replaced by a core of tempered steel. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell between them. "They will come here," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Silas replied, his voice grim. "They will come." He took a deep breath, the next words the hardest he'd had to say. "You have a choice. We can fight them here, on this land, or I can help you run. Take you further west, where Croft's reach can't extend. I'll give you all the money I have. You can start a new life." He was offering her an escape, a way out of the violence that he was about to bring down upon them. It was his duty to offer it. He owed her that. Elara was quiet for a long moment. Her gaze drifted from his face to the small plot of earth behind the cabin, where the green shoots of her garden were pushing bravely through the soil. She looked at the sturdy walls of the cabin, the porch where they had shared so many silences, the land that had given her refuge when she had nothing. Then her eyes returned to his. She saw the conflict in them, the wariness of a man being forced back into a fight he never wanted. She saw the ghost of the hunter he was trying to suppress, and she saw the decent, honorable man who had mended her dress and carved her a wood. "What I ran from that church," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I was running from a life that wasn't mine. When I came here, I was just surviving." She took a step closer to him. "But this," she said, gesturing to the cabin, to the garden, to the space between them, "this is the first place that has ever felt like home." She looked up at him, her decision made, her resolve as solid as his own. "I am done running, Silas. This is my home now. I will not let him take it from me." Her words settled into him, a strange mixture of relief and dread. He had his answer. They would make their stand here. A grim sense of purpose took hold of them both, forging a new, unspoken pact. The time for quiet coexistence was over. This was an alliance forged for war. The preparations began immediately. There was no panic, only a cold, methodical focus. The homestead was no longer just a home, it became a fortress. Silas, drawing on a part of himself he had long kept dormant, surveyed the land with a tactician's eye. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain, every blind spot. He walked the perimeter with Elara, explaining his plan in low, direct tones. "They planning? They'll likely approach from the south, using the low ridge for cover. The barn will be their first target, to draw us out." Elara listened, her face pale but determined. She was not a passive damsel to be protected. She was a partner in this defense. "The window in the loft," she said, her voice steady. "It has a clear view of the south ridge." Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eye. He had underestimated her. He had seen her resilience, but now he was seeing her mind at work, a sharp, practical intelligence. He nodded. "Good. We'll need a lookout." They worked together through the day and into the night. They reinforced the cabin door, barricaded the lower windows, and moved supplies, water, ammunition, medical bandages, into strategic positions. Silas cleaned and oiled his weapons, a Winchester rifle and his Colt revolver with a familiar, practiced ease that sent a chill down Elara's spine. She was seeing the man he used to be, the bounty hunter, and it was both terrifying and reassuring. For her part, Elara gathered what she could use. She sharpened the blade of the spade from her garden until it was a wicked edge. She boiled water, prepared clean cloths for bandages, her domestic skills repurposed for the grim necessities of conflict. There was no fear in her movements, only a resolute focus. As they worked, a new kind of intimacy grew between them. They moved around each other in the small cabin with an effortless grace, their shared purpose a powerful, unifying force. In a moment of quiet, as Silas checked the load in his rifle, Elara came and stood beside him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were tense, hard as rock. "You are not alone in this, Silas," she said softly. He looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes. The weight of his past, the ghost of Willow Creek, had been a solitary burden for so long. To have someone stand beside him, to share the weight, was a feeling so foreign, it almost broke him. He simply nodded, unable to speak, and placed his own hand over hers for a brief, powerful moment. It was a promise. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The arrival came not with a thunderous charge, but with the subtlety of a snake gliding through grass. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, ominous shadows across the land. Elara, stationed in the barn loft as they had planned, saw him first. A single rider, approaching slowly, not from the south ridge as Silas had predicted, but straight up the main track, as if he were an invited guest. He rode with an arrogant, unhurried ease that was more menacing than any army. "Silas," Elara called down, her voice tight with alarm. "One rider, coming up the path." Silas moved to the cabin door, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. He peered through a crack in the barricade. He didn't need to see the man's face to know who it was. He knew the posture, the insolent slump in the saddle. Marcus Thorne. A cold dread, colder than the fear of Croft's men, settled in Silas's gut. This was not just Croft's anger anymore. This was his own past riding up to his front door for a reckoning. Thorne reined his horse to a stop a good 50 yards from the cabin, well out of easy pistol range. He dismounted, a slow, deliberate movement, and leaned against his horse, crossing his arms. He looked the homestead over with a mocking, critical eye. "Quite the little kingdom you've carved out for yourself, Silas," Thorne called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "A bit dusty for my tastes. And the company seems complicated." Silas remained silent, his face a granite mask. He would not give Thorne the satisfaction of a response. This was a psychological game, Thorne's specialty. He would try to unnerve, to provoke, to find a crack in Silas's resolve. "I'm not here for you, old friend," Thorne continued, his tone conversational, laced with poison. "Though I admit, this is a pleasant surprise. I'm here for the girl. Mr. Croft wants his property back. Just send her out and I'll ride away. We can pretend this little reunion never happened." Silas's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. The casual way Thorne referred to Elara as property stoked the fire of his rage. He could feel Elara's presence behind him in the cabin, her silent, steadfast support. "She's not property," Silas called back, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And she's not leaving." A slow, cruel smile spread across Thorne's face. "Always the protector, weren't you, Silas? How did that work out for you last time? In Willow Creek, what were their names again? Maria, Little Daniel?" The names hit Silas like a physical blow. He flinched, the memory rising up, vivid and horrific. The smell of smoke, the sound of a woman's scream, the sight of a child's toy lying in the dust. It was the wound he had carried for years, the failure that defined him. And Thorne was now twisting the knife. Thorne saw the flinch, the flicker of pain in Silas's posture, and pressed his advantage. His voice became a venomous whisper that carried across the yard, intended not just for Silas, but for the woman he knew was listening. "You see, your quiet man of the woods here has a history," Thorne projected, his words dripping with malicious glee. "He wasn't always a farmer. He was a hunter, like me, and he was good, until he got soft. Until he made a promise to a woman, a farmer's wife, that he would protect her and her boy from the men who wanted their land." Silas's breathing was shallow. He closed his eyes, the images replaying in his mind, the ambush, the fire, his own helplessness as he was pinned down, unable to reach them. "He failed." Thorne's voice cut through the memory like a shard of glass. "He let them die, watched their home burn to the ground with them inside it, all because he wasn't ruthless enough." He hesitated, and they paid the price for his weakness. He paused, letting the poison sink in. "So you have to ask yourself, girl," he called out, his voice aimed at the silent cabin. "Is this really the man you want protecting you? A man with a history of broken promises and dead women? He's cursed. Everything he touches turns to ash." Inside the cabin, Elara listened, her heart aching. For the pain she could feel radiating from Silas, she saw his shoulders slump, the immense weight of that old guilt pressing down on him. Thorne's words were calculated to destroy him, to break the fragile trust they had built. She looked at the man before her, a man silhouetted against the door, bearing the wounds of a past he could not escape. She saw not the failure Thorn described, but the penitent man who had lived with that failure every single day since she saw the man who had mended her dress, given her a home, and stood up for her when no one else would. She walked forward and stood beside him, her presence a silent, unwavering statement. She placed her hand on his back, a simple, grounding touch. Silas opened his eyes. He looked down at her, and in her gaze he saw not the judgment or fear he expected, but a deep, profound faith. He saw that Thorn's poison had failed. Her trust was not a fragile thing to be broken by the ghosts of his past. It was an anchor. He straightened up, the weight on his shoulders not gone but bearable now. He turned his gaze back to Thorn, his eyes clear and cold. "You're done talking, Marcus," Silas said, his voice devoid of all emotion save a final chilling resolve. And in that moment, Thorn knew his psychological games were over. The shift was instantaneous. The war of words ended and the war of iron began. With a sharp whistle, Thorn signaled the men he had hidden along the south ridge. Figures rose from behind the rocks, Jedediah Croft and a half-dozen of his hired thugs, rifles in hand. They opened fire, a volley of shots tearing into the walls of the cabin and the barn. Splinters flew, and the air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire and the whine of ricocheting bullets. Silas shoved Ilara away from the door, toward the relative safety of the stone hearth. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a harsh bark. He returned fire through a crack in the barricade, his Winchester roaring to life. His shots were not wild. Each was a carefully aimed response, meant to suppress, to control the field. He was the hunter again, his mind a cold, clear instrument of combat. From the barn loft a shot rang out, sharp and distinct. One of Croft's men on the ridge cried out and dropped his rifle, clutching a wounded shoulder. Silas glanced toward the barn in astonishment. Ilara was not cowering. She had found an old hunting rifle he kept in the loft, and with a steady hand she was fighting back. Her bravery sent a surge of fierce pride through him, momentarily eclipsing the danger. The battle raged, a chaotic exchange of fire. Croft and his men were disorganized, their attack predicated on the idea of a simple retrieval. They were not prepared for a coordinated, determined defense. Silas and Ilara, moving in a grim concert between the cabin and the barn, held them at bay. But Thorn was different. He was not a thug, he was a predator. While the others provided covering fire, he moved, using the chaos to his advantage, circling around toward the blind side of the cabin. Silas caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. "Thorn is flanking, west side," he yelled to Ilara. He knew he had to meet him. Leaving the main fireplate to Ilara, he slipped out the back of the cabin, using the meager cover of a water trough to move toward the west wall. He rounded the corner, just as Thorn did. They came face to face, no more than 10 feet apart. For a second, time seemed to stop. The two former partners, the two sides of a violent past, stared at each other over the barrels of their pistols. There were no more words to be said, only the final, brutal punctuation of a gunshot. The world narrowed to the space between the two men. Gunshots from the front of the homestead faded into a dull roar, a distant storm. Here, there was only the cold focus of the duel. Thorn's lips twisted into a final predatory sneer as his finger tightened on the trigger. Silas fired a fraction of a second sooner. His shot was not aimed to kill but to disarm. The bullet struck Thorn's pistol, sending it spinning from his grasp with a sharp crack of metal on metal. Thorn cried out, his hand numb and bleeding, staring in disbelief at his empty fist. Before he could recover, Silas closed the distance, slamming the butt of his rifle into Thorn's gut. The air rushed out of Thorn's lungs, and he staggered back. But he was wiry and fast, recovering quickly and lunging, tackling Silas to the ground. They rolled in the dust, a tangle of limbs and fury. It was no longer a gunfight, it was a brawl, brutal and personal, a culmination of years of resentment and betrayal. Meanwhile, at the front, Croft saw his opportunity. With Silas occupied, he rallied his men for a final charge on the cabin. "He's busy, go, get the girl," he roared, his voice thick with greed and desperation. Ilara, seeing them advance from her perch in the loft, knew she couldn't hold them all off. As Croft and his men charged across the open yard, their eyes fixed on the cabin door, a new threat appeared from above. Ilara, with a cry of defiance, lit the lantern's wick and kicked the bale of hay out of the loft. It tumbled down, landing squarely in the path of the charging men. She threw the lit lantern after it. The glass shattered, and the oil ignited, the dry hay in a sudden explosive whoosh of fire. A wall of flame and thick, choking smoke erupted between the men and the cabin. They scrambled back, shouting in panic and confusion, their charge completely broken. The diversion was the opening Silas needed. He delivered a final, concussive blow to Thorn's head, knocking him unconscious. He rose to his feet, breathing heavily just as Croft, his face a mask of terror at the fire, turned to flee. Their eyes met across the yard. Croft's bravado was gone, replaced by the pathetic fear of a bully whose power had just been incinerated before his eyes. Without a word, he and his remaining men scrambled away, disappearing back over the ridge, a defeated, routed mob. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the hungry crackle of the burning hay. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Silas stood panting, his gaze fixed on the retreating forms of Croft's men until they were gone. He looked at the unconscious form of Marcus Thorne at his feet, then toward the barn, where Alara was already climbing down from the loft, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with adrenaline. The fire was contained, burning itself out. In the middle of the yard, a pyre for their victory. He walked to meet her. They stopped a few feet from each other, the space between them charged with the aftermath of the battle. They had faced the storm together, and had not broken. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The soot on her cheek, the fierce light in her eyes, the steady set of her jaw. She was not the broken thing he had found in the mud. She was a warrior. She was the woman who had saved him, not just from Thorne's attack, but from the ghosts that had held him captive for years. He took a step forward, and gently with the back of his thumb wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, reverent. "You were remarkable," he said, the words inadequate but all he had. She gave him a small, trembling smile. "You once told me the past is a ghost," she said softly. "I think we just chased a few of them away." Silas looked over at Thorne's still form. He felt no triumph, only a deep, weary relief. He walked over and bound his former partner's hands and feet. He would be turned over to the nearest federal marshal, his story a matter for the law now, not for Silas. As the last of the hayfire dwindled to smoldering embers, Silas and Alara stood together in the yard of their battered but unbroken home. They began the slow work of putting things back in order, clearing the debris, tending to the splintered wood of their walls. They moved in a comfortable, synchronized rhythm, their shared ordeal having forged a bond far stronger than any words could express. They had faced his past and her present, and they had won. The quiet that settled over the homestead that evening was not the silence of solitude or caution. It was the quiet of peace, hard-won and deeply cherished. It was the sound of a new beginning. Months passed. The seasons turned, healing the scars on the land and on their souls. The splintered wood of the cabin was replaced, the bullet holes patched over, becoming faint reminders of the day their quiet life was threatened. Marcus Thorne was gone, delivered to the law, his chapter in Silas's life finally, irrevocably closed. Word trickled back that Jedediah Croft, humiliated and his authority shattered, had sold his holdings and moved away, a ghost in his own right, banished from the town he once ruled. The homestead, once a place of penance for Silas, transformed into a place of genuine peace. The most profound change was in Alara's garden. It thrived under her patient care, expanding from a small patch into a vibrant testament to her nurturing spirit. Rows of corn stood tall, squash vines crept along the earth, and bright red beans hung from their stalks. It was a riot of life and color against the muted tones of the plains, a symbol of the hope she had planted and cultivated. Their love story was written not in grand declarations but in the quiet, daily poetry of their life together. It was in the way he'd bring her a cup of coffee in the cool morning as she tended her plants. It was in the way she'd mend a tear in his shirt before he even noticed it was there. It was in the shared smiles across the dinner table, the comfortable silence as they sat on the porch and watched the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. One evening, as they sat on the porch steps, Alara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. His arm came around her naturally, holding her close. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and growing things. He was no longer the haunted man she had first met. The lines of sorrow around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. And she was no longer the frightened fugitive. She was a woman who had found. The strength had found her. Strength who had found. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" she asked softly, thinking of the profound solitude he had once surrounded himself with. Silas was silent for a moment, looking out at the vast, peaceful land that was theirs. He thought of the empty, echoing silence of his past, and contrasted it with the warm, living quiet he now shared with her. "No," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "This is a better quiet." He placed a kiss on the top of her head. In the fading light they sat together, two solitary souls who had found their harbor in each other, their roots intertwined, like the stubborn life-giving plants in the garden. The land was no longer a prison or a battlefield. It was a paradise they had built together, a testament to the redemptive power of a love that had grown, against all odds, in the harshest of soil. She ran from a life that was not her own, and he was a man running from himself. In the heart of a desolate land, their two desperate paths converged, creating a sanctuary where there was none. You've just witnessed a story about the quiet strength it takes to heal, both from the wounds the world inflicts and the ones we carry within ourselves. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most profound acts of bravery aren't loud battles, but the silent, stubborn choice to plant a garden in the wilderness, to trust again when you've been broken, and to stand and fight for the small patch of ground you call home. This was a tale of grit-lit romance, where love isn't a flight of fancy, but a foundation built stone by stone, through action, loyalty, and a shared unspoken understanding. If these kinds of deep emotional stories about resilience and the redemptive power of connection resonate with you, stories that find beauty in the struggle and hope in the quiet moments, then you're in the right place. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. We are dedicated to bringing you more inspirational short films and poetic dramas that explore the depths of the human heart. Thank you for watching, and for believing in the power of a quiet, earned love.